Funny how the people who call you a failure are usually the ones who never bothered to learn your story. Those words stayed in my mind as I parked my 10-year-old pickup truck outside the country club where my mother was celebrating her 63rd birthday. The parking lot looked like a luxury car showroom, filled with polished SUVs, imported sports cars, and expensive sedans that reflected the afternoon sun like mirrors. My old truck stood out immediately, its faded blue paint and a small scratch near the rear bumper making it look older than it really was. I could have replaced it years ago, but I never saw a reason to spend money just to impress strangers. Unfortunately, my family had always measured success by appearances. Before I even reached the front entrance, I heard my younger sister, Emily, laughing. She was standing beside our parents wearing a designer dress, holding the keys to her brand new luxury SUV where everyone could see them. My father, David Carter, spotted my truck before he noticed me. He smiled the same tired smile I had known since childhood, the one that always appeared a second before another disappointment. "Nathan," he called loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "That old truck is still running? I figured it would finally give up before you did." A few relatives laughed politely. My mother, Linda, shook her head as if she had expected nothing better. "Honey," she said with an almost sympathetic smile, "one day you have to stop pretending everything is fine. You cannot live like this forever." I simply smiled and walked toward them. "Happy birthday, Mom." I handed her a neatly wrapped box with a simple silver ribbon. She accepted it without opening it, placing it on a nearby gift table crowded with oversized packages wrapped in expensive paper. Emily glanced at my gift before looking back at me. "Please tell me that is not another homemade present," she joked. "Mom deserves something nicer than that." More quiet laughter followed. I had learned long ago that defending myself never changed anything. Every explanation only became another reason for someone to tell me why I was wrong. So I nodded once and let the conversation move on without me. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across elegant white tablecloths and polished hardwood floors. A jazz trio played softly in one corner, while servers carried trays filled with appetizers and sparkling drinks. Family members gathered around Emily, asking about her latest promotion, her expensive vacations, and the luxury condominium she had recently purchased downtown. I answered a few polite questions whenever someone remembered I was standing there, but most conversations drifted away before I finished a sentence. It was familiar territory. Ever since I was a teenager, Emily had been introduced as the successful child, while I became the one everyone quietly worried about. My father often said that success announced itself. Looking around that ballroom, I wondered if he had ever considered that real success sometimes preferred silence. As dinner began, my father raised his glass for a birthday toast. He thanked friends, relatives, and everyone who had supported our family over the years. Then, almost as an afterthought, he looked directly at me. "Life teaches different lessons to different people," he said with a smile. "Some children learn how to build a future. Others eventually learn what happens when they waste their potential." Several guests shifted awkwardly in their seats, but no one challenged him. Emily laughed softly before taking another sip of wine. I noticed one of my cousins avoiding eye contact with me, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to interrupt the moment. My mother reached across the table and gently touched my father's arm as though encouraging him to stop, yet she never disagreed with anything he had said. I quietly continued eating. Years ago, those comments would have ruined my entire evening. Now they felt strangely distant, almost like hearing an old recording that no longer belonged to my life. After dessert, Emily began describing an upcoming business conference where her company hoped to secure a major partnership. "If this deal goes through," she said proudly, "our entire division could double in size within a year." My father beamed with pride. "That is what ambition looks like," he declared. "Some people chase opportunities. Others spend their lives making excuses." His eyes settled on me again. Before anyone could continue the conversation, my phone vibrated inside my jacket pocket. I glanced at the screen for only a second. The caller identification displayed a familiar name I had seen many times before, but one that no one at the table would have recognized. I quietly declined the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Emily noticed the movement and smiled. "Another recruiter turning you down?" she asked. "Or maybe another collection agency?" More laughter circled the table. I simply picked up my glass of water and smiled. "Just someone checking in," I replied. My father leaned back in his chair with obvious satisfaction. Nathan, you know what your biggest problem has always been? He asked. You think staying quiet makes people mysterious. It does not. It only makes people wonder what went wrong. I looked around the room. Everyone waited for me to defend myself. Instead, I thanked the waiter who refilled my glass and continued eating. My silence seemed to frustrate them even more than an argument would have. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated again. This time it was followed by a text message. I looked down briefly. The message contained only one sentence. Your aircraft is confirmed for tomorrow morning. The board is looking forward to seeing you. I locked the screen before anyone could notice the words. Emily rolled her eyes. Still pretending to be important? She asked with a laugh. You should really stop watching those business movies. I smiled politely, slipped the phone back into my jacket, and looked toward the ballroom windows where the evening sun was beginning to disappear behind the city skyline. Tomorrow morning was going to change everything, but not because I planned to prove anyone wrong. The truth had been quietly waiting for years, and it was finally about to introduce itself. That night, I drove home beneath a quiet sky, the city lights reflecting across the windshield of the same old pickup truck everyone loved to mock. The silence inside the cab felt comforting after hours of smiling through conversations that never really included me. I did not turn on the radio. I did not replay every joke in my head anymore. Years earlier, I would have questioned every decision I had made, wondering whether my father had been right all along. But time had taught me something far more valuable than approval. It had taught me that confidence did not grow from applause. It grew from surviving without it. As I pulled into the driveway of my small brick house on the edge of town, I looked at the modest front porch, the flower beds I watered every weekend, and the single porch light glowing softly against the evening darkness. It was not a mansion. It was not located in the wealthiest neighborhood. Yet every payment had been made on time. Every piece of furniture inside had been chosen because I liked it instead of because it impressed someone else. It was the first place that had ever truly felt like home. Growing up, home had always been measured by comparison. Emily earned an excellent grade, so I was asked why mine was lower. Emily joined student government, so I was told to become more outgoing. Emily won scholarships, and my father proudly framed every certificate in the hallway. My achievements were acknowledged politely before attention returned to her. At first, I believed I simply needed to work harder. I stayed late after school, accepted extra assignments, and spent weekends helping neighbors with odd jobs so I could save money for college expenses. My father appreciated hard work only when it produced visible results. If success was not immediate, he considered the effort a waste of time. By the time I graduated, Emily already had a clear career path that matched everything my parents admired. She enjoyed networking events, elegant offices, and conversations about promotions. I respected her ambition because she had worked hard for many of those opportunities. What hurt was never her success. What hurt was the belief that there could only be one successful child in the family. When I accepted an entry-level position at a small technology startup across the state, my father barely reacted. He asked one question over dinner. How many employees does the company have? I answered honestly. About 12. He smiled politely before returning to his meal. Call me when you find a real company. That sentence followed me for years. The startup occupied an old warehouse with peeling paint, mismatched desks, and computers that seemed older than some of the employees. During my first month, I assembled office furniture, answered customer support emails, carried shipping boxes, and occasionally cleaned the break room because everyone did whatever needed to be done. There were no executive offices. There were no reserved parking spaces. Nobody cared about job titles. We cared about solving problems. Every challenge became another lesson. Every mistake became another opportunity to improve. Some months we wondered whether payroll would arrive on time. Investors said no more often than they said yes. Products failed. Plans changed. We celebrated tiny victories because they were all we had. Through every difficult season, I remembered my father's voice telling me to find a real company. Instead of discouraging me, those words became fuel. I decided that if success ever came, it would arrive quietly. As the years passed, the company slowly grew. 12 employees became 30. 30 became 100. We moved into a larger office. Customers who had ignored us suddenly wanted meetings. Industry publications began mentioning our work. Still, I never shared any of it with my parents. Not because I wanted revenge, because every conversation with them eventually became a competition. I grew tired of defending choices that already made perfect sense to me. My family interpreted silence as failure. I discovered that silence could also be freedom. While Emily filled social media with vacation photographs, luxury restaurants, and professional milestones, my online accounts remained almost empty. I rarely posted anything beyond an occasional picture of a hiking trail or a sunrise. Friends sometimes joked that I disappeared for months at a time. The truth was simple. I enjoyed building things more than talking about them. During holidays, my parents continued asking whether I had considered finding stable employment. My father clipped newspaper advertisements for management positions at large corporations and handed them to me as though I needed saving. My mother gently suggested that perhaps I should move closer to home because living modestly in another city did not seem worthwhile. I thanked them both every time and quietly changed the subject. They never realized that the modest apartment I rented during those early years eventually became the small house I purchased without borrowing beyond what I considered comfortable. They never asked how I managed it because they assumed the answer could not possibly be impressive. Looking back, I realized something unexpected. My parents never truly knew my adult life. They knew the version they had created in their minds. A quiet son driving an old truck, wearing ordinary clothes, and avoiding attention naturally fit the story they had been telling themselves for years. It was easier for them to believe I had settled for less than to imagine I had simply chosen a different definition of success. Before going to bed that evening, I picked up my phone once more. Another message had arrived from my executive assistant confirming the itinerary for the following morning, including transportation to the conference center and the final agenda approved by the board of directors. I smiled briefly before placing the phone on my nightstand. In less than 24 hours, my family would unknowingly walk into a world they had insisted could never belong to me. The next morning began long before sunrise. I woke at 5:30, brewed a simple cup of black coffee, and stepped onto my back porch for a few quiet minutes before the day officially started. The neighborhood was still asleep. A light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the cool morning air, and the first rays of sunlight slowly appeared above the rooftops. I had always enjoyed mornings because they belonged to no one else. Before phone calls, meetings, and expectations filled the hours ahead, there was a brief moment when everything felt simple. I looked down at the old pickup truck parked in the driveway and smiled to myself. It had been with me through nearly every stage of my adult life. It had carried furniture into my first apartment, transported equipment during the early days of our startup, survived countless business trips, and reminded me every day that usefulness mattered far more than appearance. An hour later, a black executive sedan quietly pulled into my driveway exactly on schedule. The driver stepped out wearing a dark suit and greeted me with a respectful smile. He loaded my single leather briefcase into the trunk without asking any unnecessary questions. Before leaving, I locked the front door, took one last glance at the modest house, and climbed into the back seat. The driver merged onto the interstate while reviewing the morning schedule. We would arrive at the conference center shortly before the board meeting, followed by the public partnership announcement scheduled for late morning. I nodded and spent the remainder of the drive reviewing notes on my tablet, instead of looking out the window. Across town, my parents were beginning their own morning with entirely different expectations. Emily had called them early, excited about what she believed would become the biggest opportunity of her career. Her company had spent months preparing a proposal for a strategic partnership with one of the fastest-growing technology firms in the country. Although the identity of the company's founder remained surprisingly private, industry magazines frequently described the business as one of the most influential success stories of the decade. Emily had repeated those articles over dinner many times, often praising the mysterious founder for extraordinary business instincts while never imagining she had actually known him for most of her life. My father proudly agreed to accompany her to the conference as a family guest. He wore his favorite navy suit, carefully polished his shoes, and reminded everyone that important business relationships often depended on making the right first impression. My mother chose an elegant cream-colored dress and spent extra time making sure every detail looked perfect. Emily drove them downtown in her luxury SUV, confident that by the end of the day her career would reach an entirely new level. As they approached the impressive glass conference center, Hundreds of attendees streamed through the main entrance carrying branded folders and conference badges. Luxury vehicles lined the valet entrance, while photographers captured images of executives arriving from around the country. Emily smiled proudly as she checked in at the registration desk and collected guest credentials for herself and my parents. My father quietly admired the scale of the event. "This," he said, looking around the enormous lobby filled with digital displays and corporate exhibits, "is where real success happens." Meanwhile, the executive sedan carrying me entered through a separate security entrance reserved for speakers and senior leadership. The security staff greeted me by name before opening the private access gate. Several members of the event management team welcomed me inside, handing me the final presentation schedule and confirming that the media interviews would begin immediately after the keynote ceremony. I thanked each of them before walking toward the executive lounge, exchanging friendly greetings with familiar board members, investors, and department leaders who had traveled from offices across the country. None of those conversations lasted long because everyone knew the morning would be busy. Inside the executive lounge, James Whitmore, the company's chief executive officer, walked over with his usual calm confidence and extended his hand. "Everything is ready," he said. "The board unanimously approved the final announcement last night. We are excited for the public to finally hear your story." I smiled politely. "Today is about the company," I answered. James laughed softly. "You always say that. Unfortunately for you, the company would not exist without the person who built it." He adjusted his tie before continuing. "The media has spent years trying to discover why you stayed out of the spotlight. They are finally going to get their answer." I simply nodded. Remaining anonymous had never been part of a grand strategy. In the beginning, nobody cared who I was because the company was too small to attract attention. Later, when success arrived, I discovered that privacy allowed me to focus on building instead of performing. While other founders became celebrities, I spent my time improving products, mentoring employees, and expanding quietly. It turned out that the less people knew about me personally, the more attention they gave to the work itself. Downstairs, Emily and my parents found seats near the front of the enormous auditorium reserved for invited business partners. Large screens displayed promotional videos celebrating innovation, leadership, and entrepreneurship. Emily eagerly studied the conference program. She noticed that the founder's keynote appearance remained listed only as a special announcement without revealing a name or photograph. "They really know how to build suspense," she whispered. My father smiled with admiration. Successful people understand the value of reputation. At that exact moment, just beyond the stage curtains, I stood with James Whitmore reviewing the final sequence of the presentation. A production manager counted down the remaining minutes before the opening ceremony. The audience had no idea how close they already were to discovering the secret they had spent years trying to imagine, and my own family was sitting only a few rows away, still completely convinced that I could never belong on the other side of those curtains. The lights inside the auditorium slowly dimmed as a calm voice welcomed hundreds of guests from across the country. Conversations faded into silence while enormous screens illuminated the stage with images celebrating innovation, teamwork, and years of steady growth. Emily sat upright with excitement written across her face. She carefully adjusted the conference badge hanging around her neck before whispering to my mother that this partnership could completely transform her career. My father nodded with obvious pride. He looked around at the executives filling the premium seating area and quietly said, "These are the people who shape the future. This is the level every ambitious professional should reach." My mother smiled politely, then glanced at the event program once more. "I wonder what the founder is really like," she asked. Emily answered, "Immediately. Whoever built this company must be incredibly confident. People do not create something this successful without wanting the world to know who they are." I almost smiled as I listened through the backstage audio monitor. It was another reminder that people often confused visibility with achievement. For years, I had intentionally stayed out of photographs, interviews, and promotional campaigns. Every major media request had been redirected toward James Whitmore or other members of the executive leadership team because they genuinely enjoyed public speaking. I preferred conference rooms to television studios, product meetings to magazine covers, and customer feedback to personal recognition. That decision had become part of the company's culture. We celebrated ideas more than personalities. We rewarded teamwork instead of individual fame. Ironically, the more anonymous I remained, the more curiosity grew about the person behind the business. James stood beside me reviewing the final order of presentations. He looked completely relaxed despite the significance of the morning. "Reporters have been asking again whether we are finally revealing your identity," he said with a smile. I told them they would need a little more patience. I laughed quietly. Patience has served everyone well so far. Before either of us spoke again, the event producer approached with a headset and counted down the remaining minutes. Final sound checks echoed through the backstage hallway while technicians adjusted cameras and lighting. Everything operated with remarkable precision after months of planning. Out in the audience, the opening presentation began with a short documentary showing the company's earliest days. Old photographs appeared across the giant screens, displaying a nearly empty warehouse, folding tables, handwritten sketches taped to unfinished walls, and a handful of determined employees assembling equipment with their own hands. None of the images clearly showed my face because I had always remained behind the camera or outside the frame whenever possible. Emily watched attentively. "It is incredible how much they accomplished in such a short time," she whispered. My father folded his arms confidently. "Vision is important," he replied. "But discipline is what separates dreamers from successful people." Hearing those words brought back memories of countless conversations throughout my life. My father genuinely believed discipline and success always looked a certain way. Expensive offices, recognized companies, public achievements, promotions announced over holiday dinners. He never imagined discipline could also mean working quietly for years without expecting recognition. The presentation continued by highlighting major milestones, new technologies, community outreach programs, scholarships, and charitable initiatives funded by the company. The audience applauded several times as employees from different departments shared short recorded messages about collaboration and long-term thinking. James watched proudly from backstage. "They have no idea what comes next," he said softly. I looked toward the curtain separating us from the audience. "That is probably for the best." Meanwhile, Emily's phone buzzed with a message from one of her coworkers seated several rows away. She smiled after reading it. "Everyone is saying this announcement could be the biggest business story of the year." My father leaned closer. "Pay attention. Opportunities like this can define an entire career." My mother quietly adjusted the gift bag she had carried from the birthday dinner, planning to meet a few acquaintances after the event. She still had no idea that the ordinary son she had gently encouraged to find stable employment was standing only a few yards behind the stage. Another executive stepped onto the platform to introduce the final segment of the morning. He spoke about perseverance, long-term commitment, and the importance of building organizations that outlast individual careers. Then he smiled toward the audience. "Many of you have asked the same question for years," he said. "Who is the founder who insisted that the mission should always receive more attention than the person?" Today, for the first time, we are honored to answer that question. A quiet wave of anticipation spread across the enormous auditorium. Cameras turned toward the stage. Reporters lifted notebooks and prepared their recording equipment. Emily leaned forward in her seat with eager curiosity while my father straightened his jacket, expecting to witness the arrival of another famous entrepreneur. Behind the curtain, James looked at me one final time. "Ready?" he asked. I took a slow breath and smiled with complete calm. "I have been ready for years." The stage manager raised one hand and silently counted backward with her fingers. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The music changed, the curtains slowly began to separate, and at that exact moment my family was still completely certain that the man they had underestimated for most of his life could not possibly be the person every single individual in that auditorium had come to see. The audience remained perfectly silent as the curtains completed their slow movement across the stage. A large screen behind me displayed nothing except the company logo against a clean white background. James Whitmore stepped confidently toward the podium, smiled warmly at the audience, and waited several seconds before speaking. "For nearly a decade," he began, "people have asked why the founder of our company refused interviews, declined awards, and insisted that every public success belonged to the entire team instead of one individual. The answer has always been very simple. He believed that building something meaningful mattered far more than becoming famous." The auditorium grew even quieter. Hundreds of business leaders, investors, reporters, and invited guests watched with complete attention. James continued, "Today that changes. Not because he wanted recognition, but because the next chapter of our company requires introducing the person whose vision made everything you see possible." He turned toward me and smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our founder, chairman of the board, and largest shareholder, Nathan Carter." For a brief moment, the room seemed frozen. Then applause erupted from every direction. Hundreds of people rose from their seats almost simultaneously. Cameras flashed continuously as photographers rushed closer to the stage. The sound of applause echoed through the enormous auditorium while I walked calmly toward the podium, shook James's hand, and thanked him quietly. I looked across the audience without searching for anyone in particular, but my eyes naturally found my family within seconds. Emily remained seated, staring at the stage with complete disbelief. Her conference booklet had slipped from her lap onto the floor without her noticing. My mother's mouth remained slightly open as though she had forgotten how to speak. My father blinked several times, his expression changing from confidence to confusion, then to absolute disbelief. He looked around the auditorium as if expecting someone to explain that there had been a mistake. Instead, he saw every executive in the front rows standing respectfully while continuing to applaud. Several members of the board approached the stage one after another, greeting me with genuine warmth before returning to their seats. The applause finally settled, allowing me to begin speaking. "Thank you for being here today," I said. "This company was never built by one person. It was built by people who believe that quiet determination could accomplish extraordinary things when given enough time." The audience listened attentively. I spoke about the early days inside the small warehouse, about employees willing to solve problems no one else wanted to solve, about customers who trusted a company that had not yet earned its reputation, and about the importance of humility during both success and failure. I deliberately avoided discussing personal wealth or business rankings because neither had ever been the reason we started. Every sentence reflected the values that had guided the company from the beginning. As I spoke, I noticed Emily slowly picking up her conference program. She immediately flipped through every page again, searching for my name as though hoping she had misunderstood the announcement. My father quietly adjusted his glasses before looking toward the giant screen behind me, where my full name now appeared beneath the company logo along with the title founder and chairman. There was no misunderstanding left to discover. During the presentation, a short video began playing behind me. It showed old photographs from the earliest years of the business. This time, several images clearly included me working beside the original team, assembling equipment, drawing product designs on whiteboards, meeting with customers inside tiny conference rooms, and celebrating milestones with employees rather than standing alone. The audience smiled as they watched the company grow from 12 employees into a nationally recognized technology leader. Revenue charts appeared only briefly before giving way to stories about scholarships, community partnerships, employee development programs, and charitable initiatives funded over the years. The emphasis remained exactly where I wanted it. Success meant creating opportunities for others. When the video ended, James returned to the stage holding a small presentation folder. "Nathan," he said, "on behalf of the board of directors, thank you for proving that leadership does not require the loudest voice in the room." He handed me the folder before quietly adding, "Congratulations." The audience applauded once again. Then the moderator announced a short networking break before the afternoon partnership meetings. Executives immediately formed small groups throughout the auditorium while reporters gathered near the stage requesting interviews. My assistant politely informed them that media questions would be scheduled later in the day. As I stepped down from the platform, dozens of employees stopped to shake my hand or thank me for creating a workplace where they felt respected. Several investors congratulated me on another successful year. Through the growing crowd, I noticed Emily standing completely still, unable to decide whether to approach me. My mother gently touched my father's arm, but he remained motionless, watching everything unfold with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger. It was not disappointment. It looked more like someone trying to rebuild an entire understanding of reality in only a few minutes. Before any member of my family reached me, another senior executive approached with an enthusiastic smile. "Nathan," he said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. Our international partners have arrived. They are looking forward to discussing the expansion plans that only you can approve." I nodded politely and followed him toward the executive conference suite. As the doors closed behind us, I glanced back one final time. My family remained standing exactly where I had left them, surrounded by hundreds of successful professionals who now understood my story far better than the people who had known me my entire life. The executive conference suite overlooked the downtown skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that filled the room with bright afternoon sunlight. A polished walnut table stretched across the center of the room, surrounded by board members, international partners, senior executives, and legal advisors who had traveled thousands of miles for this meeting. As I entered, everyone stood briefly before taking their seats. James Whitmore opened the discussion by thanking each delegation for their continued trust in our company before inviting me to present the long-term expansion strategy. For the next hour, we reviewed investment plans, research initiatives, employee development programs, and community partnerships designed to create sustainable growth rather than short-term headlines. Every decision reflected the philosophy that had guided us since the earliest days inside the old warehouse. Build carefully. Hire people of character. Solve real problems. Let results speak louder than promises. The conversation remained focused and productive until my assistant quietly entered the room during a scheduled break. She approached respectfully and spoke in a low voice. "Nathan, your family is waiting in the executive reception lounge. They asked whether you might have a few minutes to see them before the afternoon sessions begin." I paused for a moment before smiling politely. "Please let them know I will meet them after this meeting concludes. They have already waited several years. Another 30 minutes will not hurt anyone." My assistant nodded with understanding before leaving the room. James looked at me thoughtfully after the door closed. "This must be a difficult day for you." I considered the question before answering. "It is surprising," I admitted, "but it is not difficult. I stopped carrying resentment a long time ago." Several board members exchanged quiet glances, perhaps realizing there was far more behind today's announcement than the public would ever understand. The meeting resumed, ending with unanimous approval for the company's next phase of growth. As everyone gathered their documents, international partners congratulated me once again, not only for the company's achievements, but also for maintaining a culture that valued humility over personal recognition. Those compliments meant more to me than any financial milestone because culture could not be purchased. It had to be lived every day. When the final guest departed, I walked toward the executive reception lounge. The spacious room overlooked the city through another wall of glass. Comfortable leather chairs surrounded low coffee tables decorated with fresh flowers and company publications. My parents and Emily immediately stood as I entered. For several seconds, no one spoke. The same people who had always seemed to have an opinion about my life suddenly struggled to find even a single sentence. My mother finally stepped forward. "Nathan," she said quietly, we had no idea." I smiled gently. "I know." Emily looked down at the floor before meeting my eyes. "How long?" she asked softly. "How long have you been running this company?" "Since the beginning," I answered honestly. "Almost 10 years." She shook her head slowly, still trying to understand. "Why did you never tell us?" The question hung in the air. I could have listed dozens of reasons. I could have reminded them of every family dinner where my career had been dismissed before anyone asked what I actually did. I could have repeated every joke about my truck, every comparison, every assumption. Instead, I simply answered with the truth. Because nobody ever asked with genuine curiosity. Most conversations ended before I had the chance to explain anything. My father remained unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke. "I thought you were struggling." His voice lacked the certainty it had always carried. "You never corrected us." I nodded. Calmly. "At first I tried. Then I realized that people only hear answers when they are willing to ask honest questions. Eventually, I decided my energy was better spent building my future than defending it." My father lowered his eyes. For perhaps the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty instead of confidence. "I owe you an apology," he said. "More than one." The words surprised everyone, including him. He took a slow breath before continuing. "I believe success had only one appearance. I judged you because you did not fit the picture I had already created in my mind. I never noticed that you were quietly creating something much greater than I imagined." My mother wiped a small tear from the corner of her eye before speaking. "Every birthday, Every holiday, every family gathering. I kept asking whether you were doing all right. I never realized you were protecting your privacy, not hiding your failure. Emily looked genuinely embarrassed. I made jokes about your truck yesterday. I smiled. It is still a reliable truck. She laughed softly through her embarrassment. I cannot believe you drove that truck to a conference where everyone else arrived in luxury cars. It gets excellent gas mileage, I replied, and for the first time that day all four of us shared a quiet laugh. The tension eased, but the years between us did not disappear. My father looked around the elegant reception lounge before asking another question. Are you angry with us? I thought carefully before answering, because honesty mattered more than comfort. No, I said. I was hurt for a long time. There is a difference. Hurt fades when people stop measuring themselves by someone else's expectations. Anger would only keep me connected to the past. I chose something better. Silence returned, but this time it felt peaceful rather than uncomfortable. My assistant entered once more to remind me that representatives from several international organizations had arrived for the next round of meetings. I thanked her and turned back toward my family. I have another session beginning in a few minutes, I said. If you would like, we can have dinner together this evening after everything is finished. Not to talk about business, just as a family. My mother smiled immediately. Emily nodded with quiet gratitude. My father hesitated for only a moment before answering. We would like that very much. As I walked toward the conference hallway once again, I realized that the greatest surprise of the day had never been the company's success. It was discovering that sometimes the truth could open a door that years of arguments had never managed to unlock. Nearly every conversation during the remainder of the afternoon centered on contracts, future investments, and long-term partnerships, but every now and then my thoughts drifted back to the expression on my father's face inside the reception lounge. For the first time in my life, he had looked at me without comparison. He had not measured me against Emily or anyone else. He had simply looked at me as his son. That realization stayed with me long after the final presentation ended and the last business delegation departed the conference center. As evening approached, the executive floors gradually became quieter. Employees gathered their laptops. Event staff carefully removed banners from the auditorium, and the constant movement that had filled the building all day slowly settled into calm efficiency. My assistant entered my office carrying the final schedule. Everything for today has been completed, she said with a smile. Your dinner reservation is confirmed for 7 o'clock. Your family arrived a few minutes ago and is waiting in the private lounge. I thanked her before closing my laptop. The financial reports, expansion agreements, and signed partnership documents would still be there tomorrow. Tonight felt more important than another business discussion. When I entered the private dining lounge inside the conference center, my parents and Emily were already seated around a small round table overlooking the city skyline. The atmosphere felt completely different from my mother's birthday dinner only 24 hours earlier. There were no sarcastic remarks waiting to be delivered. No comparisons. No audience. Just four people trying to understand one another after years of misunderstanding. My father stood as I approached. Thank you for inviting us, he said sincerely. I appreciate that you still wanted to spend time with us after everything. I smiled and took my seat. Family deserves honest conversations. We probably should have started having them years ago. Dinner arrived a few minutes later, and for the first time in a very long time our conversation felt natural. My mother asked about the company's scholarship program after remembering the video shown during the presentation. I explained how we partnered with community colleges and universities to help students who demonstrated determination rather than perfect grades because talent often appeared in unexpected places. Emily listened carefully before asking another question. Is that why your company interviews people differently than most corporations? I nodded. Resumes tell us what someone has done. Conversations tell us who someone is. We have hired remarkable people whose qualifications looked ordinary on paper because someone believed in their potential. My father quietly looked down at his plate before speaking again. I spent years believing that appearances revealed everything about a person. Expensive cars, large houses, prestigious titles. He paused before looking directly at me. I never realized how often those things hide the truth instead of revealing it. I answered gently. There is nothing wrong with success. The problem begins when success becomes the only thing we notice about people. He slowly nodded. I understand that now. Emily hesitated for a moment before asking the question that had clearly been on her mind since the conference. Nathan, was my company really negotiating with yours? I smiled. Yes. Her eyes widened slightly. Did everyone else know we were related? Only James and my executive assistant. I asked them never to mention it because I wanted your proposal evaluated fairly. Family connections should never influence business decisions. Emily leaned back in her chair, visibly relieved. Did we earn the partnership? Your team prepared an excellent proposal, I answered honestly. The board approved it because it created value for both companies. Nothing else. She released a quiet breath before smiling. Thank you for giving us the same opportunity as everyone else. That is the only way I know how to do business, I replied. My mother watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction before reaching across the table and placing her hand gently over mine. Nathan, I hope someday you can forgive us completely. I looked at each of them before answering. Forgiveness is not something I have been saving for a special occasion. I forgave all of you years ago. I simply needed time to build a life where my happiness no longer depended on anyone else's opinion. My father's eyes became noticeably emotional. I wish I had understood that sooner. I offered a small smile. We cannot change yesterday. We can only decide what tomorrow looks like. The conversation continued for another hour. Instead of discussing money or business achievements, we shared childhood memories, laughed about family vacations, and even joked about the old pickup truck that had unexpectedly become famous inside the company after several employees saw me driving it every morning. Emily laughed and said, "Please promise me one thing." I raised an eyebrow. What is that? Never sell that truck. It might be the most valuable lesson our family has ever received. We all laughed together. When dinner finally ended, we walked outside into the cool evening air. The city lights reflected across nearby buildings while people hurried along the sidewalks below. Before leaving, my father stopped beside the pickup truck I had driven to the conference center after asking the executive driver to return earlier that afternoon. He gently placed one hand on the worn hood and smiled. I spent years believing this truck represented failure, he admitted quietly. Now every scratch reminds me that I completely misunderstood my own son. I looked at the truck before looking back at him. It was never really about the truck. He nodded slowly. No, he agreed. It never was. As my parents and Emily prepared to leave, my father extended his hand toward me. Instead of shaking it, I stepped forward and embraced him. It was not a dramatic moment. There were no speeches, no applause, and no promises that everything would instantly become perfect. It was simply the beginning of a new relationship built on something we had never truly shared before. Respect. As I watched their vehicle disappear into the evening traffic, I realized that the greatest victory of my life had nothing to do with the company I had built. It was the quiet decision to let success change my circumstances without allowing it to change the kind of person I chose to become. Over the following weeks, life gradually settled into a new rhythm. But it was not because anyone suddenly forgot the past. Real change rarely happened in a single conversation. It happened through small choices repeated day after day. My parents began calling without asking whether I needed financial help or suggesting another career path. Instead, my mother wanted to know whether I had remembered to take a weekend off after traveling. My father occasionally asked about the people I worked with instead of asking how much the company had grown. The questions sounded simple, but to me they represented something completely different. For the first time, they were interested in my life instead of evaluating it. Emily and I also began speaking more often. She never asked for business favors or special treatment. Instead, she requested advice about leadership, building strong teams, and creating healthy workplace culture. I appreciated that because those conversations focused on learning rather than personal gain. One Saturday afternoon, she visited my house for the first time. She parked her luxury sport utility vehicle beside my old pickup truck and stood quietly in the driveway for a moment before smiling. "You really meant it," she laughed. "You were never planning to replace this truck." I smiled while handing her a cup of coffee. "It still starts every morning. I cannot think of a better recommendation than that." She shook her head with amusement before looking around the small property. The flower beds had recently bloomed with bright colors, and a vegetable garden stretched along the back fence. Wind gently moved through the maple trees surrounding the yard while birds filled the morning with quiet songs. Emily looked around slowly before saying something I never expected to hear. "You know, I always imagined that successful people lived in giant houses with private gates and long driveways. This place feels peaceful. I nodded. Peace has always been more valuable to me than square footage. She looked thoughtful as we walked toward the backyard. I think I spent too many years chasing the picture of success instead of asking myself what kind of life would actually make me happy. I understood exactly what she meant because I had once believed the same thing. Society often rewarded appearances before character. The challenge was remembering that applause disappeared quickly while inner peace remained long after the audience went home. A few days later, my father invited me to lunch at a small family-owned diner we had visited many times when I was growing up. It was not an expensive restaurant. The booths were slightly worn, the coffee was always hot, and nearly every customer seemed to know the staff by name. As we waited for our meals, my father looked around the familiar room before speaking quietly. "Do you remember bringing your science project here after the county fair?" I smiled immediately. The small solar-powered water pump. He nodded. "You were proud of it. I remember telling you that it was interesting, but probably not practical." He paused before continuing. "I have thought about that moment several times since the conference. You were excited to show me something you had created, and instead of encouraging you, I immediately judged whether it looked important enough." I remained silent because he did not need me to rescue him from the memory. He was finally allowing himself to see it clearly. "That was not the only time," he admitted. "There were many moments when I should have listened instead of evaluating. I believed I was preparing you for the real world, but all I really did was teach you to stop sharing your dreams with me." His honesty carried far more weight than any apology. I reached across the table and gently rested my hand on his forearm. "You cannot rewrite those years," I said calmly. "Neither can I. But every conversation we have now writes a different future." He smiled with quiet gratitude. "I intend to make the most of that opportunity." Around the same time, news of the conference slowly spread through extended family members. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had rarely contacted me suddenly wanted to reconnect. Some messages were genuine. Others clearly carried curiosity about the company or its success. I answered politely, but carefully maintained the same boundaries that had protected my peace for years. Success had changed many people's perception of me, but I refused to let it change my judgment of relationships. The people who truly mattered were those willing to know me before they knew my accomplishments. One evening, James Whitmore stopped by my office after the last meeting of the day. He leaned comfortably against the doorway and smiled. "You seem happier lately." I laughed softly. "Do I?" "Absolutely," he answered. "Not because of business. Something else changed." I considered his observation before replying. For years, I believed proving myself would finally earn acceptance. Then I discovered I did not need to prove anything at all. I only needed to live honestly. Everything else followed naturally. James nodded with understanding. "That explains why you never tried to embarrass your family after the conference. Many people would have enjoyed that moment." I looked out the office window toward the evening skyline. If I had treated them the way they once treated me, then the only thing I would have proven was that success had changed my character. I wanted it to change only my opportunities. James smiled before quietly leaving the office. His question stayed with me long after he was gone because it reminded me of something important. The greatest measure of success was never the size of a company, the balance of a bank account, or the title printed on a business card. It was the ability to remain kind after finally having every reason not to be. That lesson became the foundation for every decision I made from that day forward, and slowly, one honest conversation at a time, it became the foundation upon which my family began rebuilding the trust we had spent years believing was permanently lost. 1 year later, I found myself standing on a small stage inside a community college auditorium instead of a corporate conference hall. Sunlight poured through tall windows while students, teachers, local business owners, and community leaders filled the seats waiting for the annual scholarship ceremony to begin. Our company had expanded again during the past 12 months, opening new offices, creating hundreds of additional jobs, and investing even more heavily in education programs that help determined students build careers regardless of their financial circumstances. The growth made headlines across the country, yet the accomplishment that filled me with the greatest sense of pride was watching young people receive opportunities they had once believed were beyond their reach. My name appeared briefly on the event program, but the spotlight belonged to every student walking across that stage with hope in their eyes. As the ceremony concluded, James Whitmore joined me near the entrance and smiled. "You still avoid being the center of attention whenever possible," he joked. I laughed quietly. "Some habits are worth keeping." He nodded toward the students speaking excitedly with their families. "I think they understand exactly why you built this program." Watching parents celebrate their children's achievements reminded me how much my own family had changed during the past year. The transformation had not happened overnight. It had grown through countless ordinary moments. Sunday dinners where nobody compared careers. Phone calls that began with genuine curiosity instead of assumptions. Holidays filled with conversations about memories, hobbies, travel plans, and future dreams rather than income or status. My father no longer introduced me by mentioning the company. He introduced me simply as his son, and somehow those words carried more meaning than every business title I had ever received. A week after the scholarship ceremony, my parents invited me to another birthday dinner for my mother. This time we gathered at the same country club where everything had seemed to fall apart 1 year earlier. As I drove into the parking lot, my old blue pickup truck once again stood among rows of expensive vehicles. I smiled because nothing about that picture needed to change. When I stepped inside, my father spotted me immediately. Instead of looking toward the truck with disappointment, he walked over, wrapped me in a warm embrace, and said loudly enough for nearby relatives to hear, "There is my son. I am glad you are here." Those simple words erased years of quiet distance more effectively than any apology ever could. Throughout the evening, our relatives asked questions about the Scholarship Foundation, volunteer programs, and community projects rather than focusing on financial success. Emily proudly shared stories about how her own leadership style had changed after she stopped measuring employees by appearances alone. She explained that listening carefully had improved her team more than strict supervision ever had. I watched her speak with confidence that no longer depended on proving herself better than anyone else. My mother eventually opened the small birthday gift I had brought. Inside was a framed photograph taken during the scholarship ceremony, showing a group of students celebrating together after receiving awards. She looked at it for several quiet seconds before smiling. "This is my favorite present," she whispered. "Not because it is expensive, but because it reminds me what success is really supposed to look like." My father nodded in complete agreement. After dinner, we stepped outside together. The evening air felt almost identical to the night 1 year earlier, but everything else had changed. My father glanced toward the old pickup truck and laughed softly. "I still cannot believe you kept driving that thing." I smiled. "It still gets me wherever I need to go." He shook his head with amusement. "I used to think the truck represented everything you lacked. Now it reminds me of everything I failed to see." We stood there quietly for a moment before he added, "Thank you for giving us another chance." I looked across the parking lot where families were leaving the restaurant together, talking and laughing beneath the warm lights. Relationships are worth rebuilding when everyone is willing to build honestly, I answered. That is all any family can really do. As I drove home later that evening, I realized the greatest secret I had ever kept had never been the company, the success, or the opportunities that quietly entered my life. The greatest secret was learning that real wealth could not be measured by a bank account, a luxury vehicle, or the size of a house. Real wealth was waking up each morning with peace in your heart, surrounding yourself with people who valued your character more than your accomplishments, and understanding that you never needed to prove your worth to those who were willing to know the real you. The old pickup continued down the quiet highway beneath a sky filled with stars, carrying me toward the same modest home that had always been enough. For the first time in many years, I knew my family was no longer following an image of success. Together, we had finally discovered its true meaning.